Okay, thanks to those of you for joining us. We're just going to take another 30 seconds here, maybe 25 seconds, and then we'll get started right at 12. Well, just clicked over to 12:02. So by my clock, we're going to go ahead and get started. You good to go, Brian?
I am good to go.
Okay, great. Thanks everyone for joining us today on this last installment for the year of our, or the academic year of our AEDE Economic Outlook and Policy webinar series. Really appreciate your joining us. As I noted, this is the last one for our academic year. We'll start up again in September and have a new lineup for the basically roughly September to June time period next year. So uh, today's webinar is, we're really excited about today's webinar. Before jumping into that, I did want to just remind everybody that we do record these. And so there will be a recording of this, and that'll be available to anybody who wants to sort of share it later or have another look at it later if there's anything you might have missed. Another thing to point out is that if you have questions during the webinar, please feel free to use either the chat feature at the bottom or the Q&A feature. I'll keep track of all that. And at the end of the webinar today, we'll have a little question and answer period with Brian and go through all those questions. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Brian Murray, a long-time colleague of mine. Brian has a distinguished career. He, as you can see, is the director of the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability. An interesting thing about Brian is that he spent a long term of his career as basically a land use economist, and then was able to pivot really successfully to the energy area and is one of the well-known scholars in the energy economics area. And it's really great for us to be able to have Brian visit with us today and give this webinar. For those of you who are Ohio State fans, I did want to also mention that Brian is an avid Ohio State Buckeye fan, at least in football. And Brian Brian has one of the great experiences of all Buckeye fans that he actually was able to go to a game in 2011. Many of you will remember it. It was a losing affair. The Buckeyes lost to Penn State in 2011 here at the Shoe, but they really didn't lose because about 5 or 6 or 8 years later, Penn State had to give that game up, right? Because they had some problems with their coach. And then about a year later, the Buckeyes had to give that game up too. So, in fact, Brian was at a game that never actually happened, as we know. So, Brian, we had a good time at that game, and we're really glad to have you back here at Ohio State, at least uh, online, to give your webinar on navigating the future, clean energy, AI, and grid expansion amid policy shifts. Thanks a lot, Brian.
Thank you, Brent. It's really great to be here in terms of what be here means these days. As Brent's right, he and I have worked over 2 decades together in kind of forestry and land use, and I did take I took a pivot about 15 years ago, but I still happily work on land use issues when time allows as the director of the Institute. So let's jump right into it. I'm going to start by saying as we're really at a critical juncture right now, and I'm going to be focusing on the electricity sector, and I'm going to be focusing on the United States. But a lot of this certainly is replicable throughout the rest of the world. One is, so after a couple of decades in the United States, a fairly flat electricity demand. Another word for demand in the electricity sector is load. So flat load growth. After a 20th century of just incredible load growth, where we had a 7-time increase in the amount of electricity we used between 1950 and 2000, it really went flat for a variety of reasons after that. Energy efficiency, offshoring of energy-intensive manufacturing. But now we're at the point where it is rising again. And the large driving factor in the demand is really from data centers. And a lot of data centers are really being driven by artificial intelligence, the development of new algorithms, new applications, rapidly entering the landscape. And those that are behind the data centers and AI are a lot of them are these big tech firms, they're also called hyperscalers. So Google, Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon, Google, Apple, all of these folks. And they're the big demanders that are pushing out the growth in the electricity sector. And all of them have really ambitious climate and decarbonization commitments that they have well established for over a decade now. So as this is happening, federal government policy had a pretty remarkable shift in 2025 as a result of the 2024 election. And that's really reversed course in decarbonization. So we're kind of at this interesting time where we were flat in terms of load growth, and now we're surging, but the people who are adding to the load growth surge are those who are committed to decarbonization. But that's always coupled with national and state policy, and then that's in sort of a state of disarray right now. So it's a good time to be looking at this problem. And as I'll get to a little bit later, it's also very interesting, like week or two, to be looking at it because of what's happening in Washington right now with congressional deliberations. So a little bit more about the decarbonization of the power sector. And this is just looking at a chart from the EPA greenhouse gas inventory. They're about a year and a half behind or so. So this is through 2022, but the trend still is similar. And so if we look at this line here, are greenhouse gas emissions, so essentially carbon dioxide from electric power generation in the United States. And we'll see that around the midpoint of the first decade of this century, it kind of peaked at around 2,400 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent, and then has declined substantially. In fact, it's gone down about 36% since 2005 into the last period of the inventory here. So a very significant reduction. That's a surprise to some people. It's really been driven by two factors. The first factor was the advent or the rapid uptake of hydraulic fracturing, which made natural gas, which had been scarce and expensive, into abundant and inexpensive about 20, 25 years ago. And as a result, a lot of the base load power in the United States really kind of shifted from coal-fired generation to natural gas generation. And that's about half as emitting as coal. And then more in the last decade or so, though, has been the uptake of renewables like wind and solar. And then through all this, there's been about a steady load of nuclear. So we're going to kind of pull on all of these threads in this talk today. But basically, when you move from a heavily coal-dependent generation mix in the United States to one that's natural gas or renewables oriented, you're going to be reducing your emissions substantially, even if you're producing about the same amount of power. Now, if we look at this graph and it's a scramble, but let me just kind of isolate in two periods of time. This is the new capacity additions each year over the last 14, 15 years in the United States. And so if we look at around 2010, most of the new generation that was added was natural gas in this black line. And there was still coal that was being added at this time in this green line. There was some wind at the time that had started been uptake, but there wasn't really much else other than that. And then as we fast forward to 2024, we see essentially all of the new capacity that was added in 2024 was solar and energy storage. And there's a mix of reasons for that, both economic and policy driven. It's also good to know that this is new capacity additions, not new generation. If I could run another graph that would show new generation to show that we're now at the point where about 60% of our power in the US is generated by fossil fuels, and about 40 by zero carbon energy, either nuclear, which is about 20, and now wind and solar, which combine for almost 20 as well. Okay, so it's really changed in terms of what's being added to the grid. Decarbonization has been going on for the last couple of decades in the power sector in the US. Okay, so this leads to kind of a key question. So I referenced the big tech climate leadership and carbon commitments. Can they overcome like the physics of infrastructure development and the retreat of federal policy in terms of achieving their objectives? And the answer to this question is really going to determine whether the AI revolution that we're going through right now, and will be in for a while, will either accelerate or derail Americans' path to energy decarbonization and the corresponding goals of climate risk mitigation. So this is a really critical time to get a handle on this question and to try to dabble at some answers. So what I want to do right now is go a little bit into, I use AI. I've really gotten into it in the last year or so, trying to understand what its impact is on the energy sector. but I'm not an electrical engineer or a data scientist, but let me do my best to give sort of a layman's perspective on what we're experiencing right now. So Sam Altman, who was the founder of OpenAI, and so they're the creators of ChatGPT, he wrote sort of it was a short essay. I recommend you read it if you haven't already, because it provides some interesting insights from his perspective as someone who I guess would be seen as, if he would really be seen, I think, as the founding parent, if you will, of the AI movement in the United States, even if he wasn't the scientist who created it to begin with. You could think of him as almost like the Steve Jobs of the AI movement. But, so in his quote here, technology has brought us, through all major epochs of human civilization, social and economic development, from the Stone Age to the agricultural age, and then on to the industrial age. And so from the industrial age on, the path to the intelligence age, and by the intelligence age, we mean the ability of computation, the ability of machines to think like humans, and in fact, in some regards, be able to think beyond what the human brain capacity is. And that's going to be paved with compute, energy, and human will. And, I want to explain the subject heading I have on the slide, which is the miracle of melted sand and human ingenuity. Melted sand is essentially a reference to silicon, and you assemble silicon and some other, add some other chemicals in there to create computer chips more and more efficiently over time. And you run energy through the computer chips, and you have humans behind all this injecting brain power. And over time, what you've done is you've developed this tremendous capacity to develop artificial intelligence. And so the miracle of melted sand, after, now about 60 years of harnessing it for the purposes of the information age, has really taken us into this new human economic social epoch. So if the adoption of AI feels different, it actually is. I mean, we tend to look at other major adoptions of technology taking 2-3 decades to really sink in. And often it's rapid to begin with, for sure. But the pace at which AI has been adopted is pretty stunning. And I guess you could think of that as being, because it's really sitting on top of a lot of other things. It's sitting on top of the internet. It's sitting on top of computation, which has been with us for decades now. But it's really driving, because it is this distinct value add to society, it's really driving technological change much faster than either of the previous technologies have. So ChatGPT, just in 17 months since it's really been kind of on the market, as of last month, whatever, it has 800 million users globally. And I'm guessing that probably in the last month, a couple 100 million more we probably have over a billion users of ChatGPT. And we have a numerous number of companies that are entering the market at rates just never seen before. So a quick diagram on how AI works. So at some level, it's very simple in the sense that you can just chunk it into specific tasks. So you have inputs into the AI, machinery, if you will, and those inputs are essentially data. Data and human brains writing programming and code in order to move the data. And so the first thing you do is you try to learn from these massive amounts of data through a process called machine learning. And it's also called deep learning. And it essentially just uses the power of computation to see connection between data points and processes that otherwise were just not achievable by regular computation. So I remember, Brent and I were talking a little bit back in the days when I was a forest economist. And I remember as I was exploring PhD programs back in the 1980s, I know one university said, you could come here and study artificial intelligence. And my first thought was, I'm not exactly sure what that is. And my second thought was, once I understood it, I said, well, that just sounds like computation and statistics. I think that's probably gonna, like run its course pretty soon. And I don't want to stick my future fortunes into something that doesn't really have much of a future to it. That is not the last bad prediction I've made, but it's probably the biggest bad prediction that I've made. I'm still really glad with the track that I took and that I didn't go into that program in AI back in the 1980s, because I probably would be cooked into now obsolete tasks. But it just kind of goes to show you it's been around for a while, but it hasn't really taken off until lately. So the machine learning process is how to figure out what all that data is doing and then arrange it into neural networks that try to follow the patterns of how the human brain works in order to take information and essentially create intelligence. And you do this for computer vision, for speech recognition, language processing. So this is what ChatGPT is, a large language model that allows you to do things like throw a bunch of bullet points in there from a meeting that you were in and say, can you kind of write this up in a report that will be summarized? And it can do that in nanoseconds. I've also done something recently with just looking at some visual images. Like I took a picture of my wife and I put it in ChatGPT and I said, what would this couple's child look like 30 years from now? And then kind of created it and then compared it to a picture of my 30-year-old son. It's kind of interesting and eerie how similar that they were, but they certainly weren't identical. So it's remarkable what can be done. And so the idea is not just to learn, but actually to use it for predictive purposes. And that's really where it's having its impact now. So the real machinery underlying all this is graphic processing units, or GPUs. They've been in use for a while, just for, as the name would suggest, for graphical applications to computers. But their ability to process information rapidly and at large volume has really outpaced the traditional central processing units that have been used in computation for decades now. And they're really what has been necessary to build these machine learning models, to do data visualizations, to do large language processing. We've really needed these GPUs to make it happen. And so these data centers are basically large collections of GPUs, and they use a huge, huge amount of electricity. So here's some pictures of it. The one on the left is an AI-generated image of a data center with a lot of GPUs in it. But these are real photos on the right of data centers that have been out there. I mean, the one thing I want to point to you is its connection to power lines and to energy sources, because they do absorb a lot of electricity, and I'll show some more detailed data in a moment, but that's really been, driving the demand surge that we're looking at now. So this is some work from a colleague of mine who's a new PhD student at Duke, Tyler Norris, and I'm going to talk about a report that he and colleagues at the Institute issued in just a moment. But what I'm going to do is also sort of draw some fundamental data that they have in this report released by the Nicholas Institute this February. And basically what you see, if you look at the figure on the right, you see, the chart kind of shows the growth in data center electricity use over the last 10 years or so. And you see there was a steady uptick, starting around 2020, really a little bit before that. And, still a lot of it is driven by just conventional servers. I mean, everything we do on the internet and everything, our phones and all the pictures that we take and the videos and the cat videos that we see on the internet are all they all need servers, and that's all happening. But what's really happened in the last 4 or 5 years in particular is servers that are specialized just for AI applications. And so that's the purple wedge that you see here. And what we're looking at as we look out for the next 5 to 10 years, a massive increase in the projected server use that's going to go to AI. And so it's, could count for almost half of the US electricity load growth for the next 5 years or so, the next 3 years. And AI workloads are expected to be about 50 to 70% of data center demand by 2030. And this happens both through hyperscaling and large location centers are driving a lot of this growth. So another figure that shows a similar trend, but simplifies it a little bit, is if we look at data center use and of the total share of electricity use. Around 2018, it was just under 2% of use. Last year, it was more than doubled to 4.4%. And projections are it could basically double in the next 3 to 5 years. Again, driven largely by, this is data center growth and driven largely by AI. And I should point out, and I had this on the first slide, AI isn't the only thing driving electrification. We've also seen onshoring of manufacturing, of energy intensive manufacturing, some of it policy driven, that has pushed things back. And then electrification of transportation and households is doing it as well. But again, more than half of this is being driven by AI and data centers. Okay, so a lot of data centers have been announced. Not all of them have been built yet, but states are scrambling to figure out what this is going to do to the power demand in their region. So 15 states in the US count for 80% of the nation's data centers. And many of you may know this, but Virginia is sort of like, it's sort of like the Saudi Arabia of data centers in terms of its role as an individual contributor. And so they have by far the largest amount of megawatts. A lot of that had to do with Amazon's relocation to Northern Virginia, or its East Coast headquarters in Northern Virginia, which really actually followed the fact that they were establishing data centers. So in the state of Virginia, about 1/4 of total electricity use is used for data centers. And we see down here on the list, Ohio. So the Buckeye State is about 9th right now. And this dark blue sliver here sort of captures that these are new announcements in Ohio for data center use. So I'm guessing those of you from Ohio who are sitting in are familiar with this trend and familiar with the issues that it's raising. So one of the real messages here of our work is that we're really not building generation capacity to match demand at this pace. So right now, GE Vernova, who's the largest producer of natural gas turbines in the US, is saying, it's about a 5-year wait for new natural gas turbines. Transformers, which are necessary for the whole transmission infrastructure, they have their lead times have risen up to 2 to 5 years, which is less than 1 year, just 4 or 5 years ago. And the costs have really gone up. And now one of the real barriers has been, so we in places where we're building capacity, so remember like the solar and the storage capacity I was talking about in a few previous slides, actually building it is one thing, but getting it to connect it to the grid is a real significant challenge. And some estimates are it's taking up to 7 to 10 years to get new generation capacity onto the grid because of a whole host of regulatory and policy factors that are keeping that from happening. So if we're talking about increasing demand, by 10, 15, 20% in just a short period of time, we're not building capacity to meet that. So it kind of raises the question, well, how are we going to meet that demand? So there's several states, regulators in several states are dealing with this. I've just kind of circled Ohio here as an example. Some of you may know just a couple of years ago, AEP issued a temporary moratorium on data center service requests till they could kind of figure out whether or not they really had the ability to meet that load. They did, come to settlement, but working with the hyperscalers and other data center folks to come to an agreement about how this was going to happen. Similar types of situations in Georgia and Indiana, where the regulatory commissions there are taking a look and either trying to really ramp up their ability to get new generation on the grid, or working with the hyperscalers to build their own and having a separate rate structure for them. A lot of these states, if you're a regulated state in a lot of the country, that means that the only company that's allowed to provide power to all users is the regulated monopoly firm. So like in North Carolina, that's Duke Energy. And so you have to get your energy from Duke Energy. But you can have an agreement between the demander and Duke Energy and the idea is instead of pushing up the rates for the other ratepayers, that you might have your own separate tariff or rate structure. So these kinds of innovations, both in terms of technology, but in terms of market innovation, are happening in real time right now. Just yesterday in the New York Times. And one of the things about preparing for something like this is like, and I do try to, since this is not as much of an academic presentation as I might make to a pure audience of researchers and more of a public-facing presentation. I mean, I often do look to, all right, so what does the media say about this week? Well, I've got all kinds of things happening this week. So this is New York Times yesterday, talking about PJM, which is the service provider, basically the independent system operator for 13 states in the the Northeast, parts of the Midwest, and down even into the Southeast. PJM is getting really beat up by the governor, saying you're really not doing your job in terms of delivering affordable power to us. You know, a lot of this again is driven if you're not building at the pace that the demand's going up. Those of you who have taken an economics course realize that that is the recipe for higher prices. So we're seeing, after really flat price growth in this region, we're seeing significant price growth in the region, both in terms of the power markets themselves, the energy markets that are happening in real-time, day-to-day basis, and the capacity markets where suppliers are being provided payment just to have capacity available for any time use over the course of the year. So anyway, a lot of concern about how this is affecting energy affordability, not just in the PJM region, but throughout the country. So in response to these factors, the Institute, this is the Nicholas Institute that I direct, which is an institute at Duke that's focused on energy, environment, sustainability. We have a very outward-facing element, but we bring the research, education, and engagement missions of Duke together in this space. And so, you know, I mentioned earlier a PhD student, Tyler Norris. Well, Tyler is not your regular PhD student in that he worked for 15 years in the energy sector before he decided he needed to come back and be an energy modeler so he could really dig deeper into the issues that he already had expertise in, but didn't have the depth of knowledge he felt that he needed. So he and a colleague at the Nicholas Institute, Tim Profeta, and then Tyler's professor over in the Nicholas School of the Environment, Dalia Patina Echeverri, and a fellow graduate student, Adam Coey-Haskell, wrote this report in February that the Energy Gang, for those of you who are real energy wonks, this is probably one of the leading podcasts out there, called it the most talked about academic paper in 2025 in the energy space, and a podcast just a few weeks ago. And the basic messages from this report are kind of reiterating a point I just made, which is we can't build as much capacity as we're projected to need in the load growth scenarios above. So the real question is, how much headroom is there in the grid? In other words, how much capacity is there in the grid to meet the demand? I mean, one of the things is we have to build capacity on the grid to handle like a couple days of high energy use. So think about actually the football stadium over at Ohio State. Maybe not the best example because you use it for parking, but a lot of other football stadiums, like professional football stadiums, they sit idle for all but like 8 days a year, but they need the capacity in order to fill the crowd those 8 days a year. Electric power sector is not too different from that. We have super hot days in the summer and we have super cold days in the winter where we need more power than we do at any other short periods of time over the course of the year, and we need to be prepared to meet that. I mean, that is the expectation, and that's what utilities are tasked to do. So there is actually a lot of capacity on the grid that we don't really use most of the time, but our real concern is, are we going to be able to meet peak load power? So then it kind of raises the question, what if we could make this new load that we're adding from data centers just a little bit more flexible? Can we curtail it when the system is most strained? And the modeling in this report showed that by allowing as little as 0.25% per year curtailment could produce up to 80 gigawatts of additional headroom, which is way more than what is needed right now to meet the new demand. And it really would buy time until the new generation can be brought onto the grid and other forms of grid reliability investments can be brought on board. So I can't do this report the due service. We could talk about bringing the main authors of this report back to Ohio State for a webinar maybe next year, but this is just a highlight. And I would look it up. It's gotten a lot of coverage not only in podcasts, but in the finance press, the earnings report of Constellation Energy by the CEO. There's a lot of fascination with this, and it's really just a first order estimate of how much headroom there is out there. So basically, this is what they did. They took a look at a typical load for like PJM, so the service independent system operator I just alluded to, and looked at historic load, and then looked at its max load that it's tended to have available for it. So this blue line here is sort of what we call original load from last year, and then just superimposed on that another, say, 10 gigawatts worth of power lead. Okay, so now where everything was below this red line, which has the max PJM winter load, now they've got this period of time in which the new load could push it over the max capacity. And since you can't instantly build new capacity, what might you be able to do? And that's curtail. Data centers need to be run all the time, and I'm going to talk about that in a bit. So what does curtailment mean? It does mean that some of the load will have to be turned off and met another way. But this, if you aggregate this over the course of the year, again, this is, maybe 20 hours or 20 to 40 hours of curtailment over the course of the year, where you need to meet that either by shifting the data center operations to other areas that can meet the load, or by having, on-site generation capacity that can be built in a fairly short period of time. There's other ways to expand grid capacity. Again, just out yesterday in my sort of daily news feed in Energy World, and this being, I sort of grabbed this because it is featuring Ohio. I mean, we need to, you've probably all heard of the term smart grid. How can we actually use the grid that we have more efficiently? And that can be done by essentially software improvements, but also by basically reconducting the power lines that are out there and putting sensors in there so that we can really expand the capacity. I mean, part of this is not just do we have the generation capacity, but do we have the capacity to move the electrons around to where it's needed? And so, there's, a new state law is going to require utilities and regulators to look at advanced transmission technologies before they build new power plants. I mean, one of the concerns there is there have been periods in the past where we've talked about how much more electricity that we need. Like at the end of the 20th century, after that load growth period of time, there was a lot of new capacity that was being built that ended up being kind of stranded. And our capacity utilization factors went way down as our demand went down while our supply was increasing. So regulators remember that period of time, and they're not necessarily all that anxious to repeat it. So they want a really good sense of how much they can extract out of the grid that they have, in addition to how much capacity needs to be built and approved. So I've been talking a lot about the demand side, but on the supply side, AI can really help on the supply side because it can help us manage the grid more efficiently in ways like I just described. So you can get a more efficient energy management system with real-time data processing. So instead of relying just on historical data to predict when things might happen in the future, they can operate with real-time data, including tomorrow's energy, tomorrow's weather forecast, to figure out how much energy we're going to need to serve a very small part of the grid tomorrow, and that can help with management. And there's pattern recognition, there's continual learning and updating to improve the predictive capability. All of this can help us manage renewable energy, which is really what's being added to the grid in the highest volumes today. How we can manage that more effectively through the kind of prediction models I was just talking about, and how we can do this to make the grid more stable. So there's a lot of hope and potential for AI on the supply side as well. Okay, so as I mentioned at the outset, the big tech firms are really leaning and have been leaning for a long time into decarbonization. But some of you may have heard that 3 Mile Island plant that was closed a couple of years ago is now going to be slated to restart because of an agreement between Constellation Energy to restart 3 Mile Island nuclear plant. They're going to call it the Crane Energy Center. And basically, it's been set up to sell power to Microsoft for their AI operations and data centers that they want to build nearby. This ends up becoming a real economic development policy for governors and for state energy offices and for state commerce offices. Google has many plans to build. There's new plans have been made for the Palisades plant up in neighboring Michigan up there. New plan announced in Illinois. So like there's a lot going on in terms of new generation planning that's going on that is driven by the big tech firms. So the most common approach to doing this really, and just a simplified diagram. So you've got the off-takers, so the firms, whether it's a big tech firm or any firm who's trying to decarbonize, what they will end up doing is they're still connected to the grid, right? And so they can't necessarily fully control where the electrons came from that come into their operation. But what they can do is set up separate agreements with renewable energy producers, or in this case that we just alluded to, nuclear energy producers. Anybody can do zero carbon energy. So they pay them to produce the zero carbon energy, which then gets fed into the grid. Sometimes it actually goes straight to the plant. But by and large, the most common thing is that gets fed into the grid, but they have an accounting of how much clean energy they've bought, and they use those credits to basically decarbonize the total load. So it doesn't necessarily match exactly when the power was generated. That gets generated and fed into the grid and used when these power plants, or I'm sorry, when these off-takers need it. But what they're basically saying is on average, they're offsetting that by buying a certain amount of zero carbon energy or paying for that to be fed into the grid. So that's the most common arrangement. And that's how like a data center that needs electricity 24/7 can buy solar power, even if it's not selling at night. They kind of do it through this type of arrangement. So I actually, one thing, and sort of looping back to the previous slide, is nuclear the new tech stock? So again, all of these are kind of stories that are surfacing in the trades and in the finance press in the last week or two. As a result of these new agreements that are happening, a whole bunch of nuclear stocks are their value, and these tend to be advanced nuclear, so small modular reactor sites. After the deal between Meta and Constellation Energy, new deal, I think that is going to feed the Illinois plant. And then that means that a lot of startups, nuclear startups who were actually starting to fold up their tent just a few months ago, are now being repowered. This is in today's Wall Street Journal. I encourage you to read that. This is a fuel reprocessor looking to feed the small modular reactors that they hope will come online. Okay, so that's kind of the AI story. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the shifts in energy policy that we're seeing at both the federal level and the effect that that may be having on states in the near future. So one of the signature initiatives of the previous administration was the Inflation Reduction Act that was signed into law in August of 2022. A major set of essentially primarily tax credits and grants for climate and energy, up to almost $400 billion, although not necessarily capped at $400 billion in climate and energy expenditures. Again, tax credits and grants. And it was projected to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the US by about 40% below 2005 by 2030, so allowing it to essentially meet the targets that were established, the US targets that were set by the Paris Climate Agreement. Okay, so all of this was kind of well underway. If we look at what happened like through mid-2024, there was already an uptick in clean energy investment going into 2022, but that really was starting to accelerate. And midway through 2024, I think we were going to see a substantial increase, and we did actually, in clean energy investment. And so this is not just new power generation, but a lot of it was also investments that were targeted for battery plants, electric vehicle manufacturing facilities. And when we look at that, it was kind of highly leveraged. That was less than $100 billion in federal expenditures luring in a bit over $400 billion in private expenditure. So the whole idea behind the Inflation Reduction Act is it was supposed to be public finance spurring many multiples of private finance, and it was targeted to do that. Some of this had actually been spent in the ground and the shovels had already been turned. And some of this was invested and ready to be turned on in 2024 and 25. And so some of that is actually being held up right now with the change that I'm about to talk about. So after the election in November of 2024, on Inauguration Day in 2025, that was a busy day. There were many executive orders that were issued that day, and many of them had to do with energy. Everything from declaring a national energy emergency and unleashing American energy on public lands through extraction of oil and gas and coal to throughout, and including specifically Alaska, to withdrawal of leasing of offshore wind in the United States, which had been taking off, and freezing IRA funding, Inflation Reduction Act funding, and announcing an intent to pull back on the IRA tax credits. Executive orders cannot by themselves remove tax credits that were agreed upon by Congress, but it can spur congressional action, which is what it has done. So just about 4 months later, that was May 22nd, 2025 was a busy day at Capitol Hill, down Pennsylvania Avenue, 16 blocks, with the passage in the House of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which passed by one vote in the House of Representatives. Of course, the Inflation Reduction Act, which I just alluded to, actually passed by one vote in the Senate back in 2022. So all of these issues are really always on a razor's edge, both because of the close division of political parties in Washington, and also just because these are really sort of critical policies. And so the Big Beautiful Bill Act accelerates the repeal of renewable energy tax credits and other types of restrictions. So basically, in a number of these tax credits were effectively repealed or significantly altered credits for everything from zero emission electricity, so basically wind, solar, and storage, clean hydrogen, advanced manufacturing. Credit transferability is a nuanced topic, but it's an important one, basically, because in order to get a lot of these clean energy projects financed, it meant that the companies that were producing them didn't really have tax liability, so they needed to be able to transfer the tax credits that they got to those who do have tax liability. And there were provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act to make that happen. Those are actually really, really important, and those are essentially set for repeal under the House bill. Energy efficiency and electric vehicle credits also cut, or they'll be gone within, say, 60 days out of the passage of the act, which basically means that they can't be done unless they were already shovel ready. There was somewhat more favorable treatment of carbon capture from natural gas operations, nuclear, new advanced and expansions of existing nuclear, and clean fuel production credits in transportation, which would be, biofuels and hydrogen fuels. So then at the same time that this has been passing, 13 members of the House, all of whom voted against or voted for the Big Beautiful Act, and therefore implicitly against these credits, are asking the Senate to go back in and fix the bill that they passed to basically either fully restore, or restore large components of the tax credits that were removed from the House bill. So it's an interesting dynamic going on there. So why would they do that? It's really, it's kind of an exercise in follow the money. And then if you look at this map over here and you look at these bubbles basically show where a lot of the credits were ending up being targeted in the Inflation Reduction Act. So you see areas of the Southeast that have like Georgia and North and South Carolina, or essentially the Battery Belt. And so there's a lot of the benefits were accruing to those regions. So a North Carolina senator who's running for reelection next year is trying to, and sees what's going on in North Carolina, which has been a rapid uptake in clean energy projects. Are there ways to save that? Also, some of the Georgia legislature as well. And then we're seeing some up in your neck of the woods, up in Ohio. So in essence, and this is what was sort of seen all along as being perhaps the political durability that something like the Inflation Reduction Act could have, which is a lot of the credits were accruing to regions that, if we just go with a simplified red and blue, a lot of the targeted regions were red regions. And so we're seeing this political dynamic play out a bit. And we're also seeing the big tech firms, again, this is yesterday's Wall Street Journal, big tech firms are fighting to save many of those credits because, it's one thing if they're willing to pay more for the power to feed their centers. They've already demonstrated that. But in the long run, they'd like to see this kind of played out where the people that they're buying power from are getting the tax credits so that they can have a more economic deal with them. And so we'll have to see. This is going to play out all in the next few weeks in terms of what the Senate does with the bill. Then it goes back to the House, what comes up into the president's desk and whether he will sign it. And then the other thing is, so after the first wave of executive orders, a new executive order, and before the passage of the big beautiful bill in the House, there was another executive order issued by the White House, basically sending a signal to state policies that any state policies that are inconsistent with federal policy in the area of energy will be explored, I guess is probably the best way to say that. So we think about this is really actually a pretty significant reversal from an entire century of energy policy in the United States, which has been very federalist. And by that we mean there are signals that are sent from the federal government, like the Inflation Reduction Act was certainly a signal sent from the federal government. Regulatory policies can be set by the federal government, but implementation has always occurred at the state level. And states have always essentially had the freedom, by and large, to institute their own state policies if they see it in the interest of their own state's energy needs and their own state's economic needs to do so. And it's hard to tell whether the executive order will do that. But for instance, North Carolina has a number of bipartisan policies that have been passed over the last 20 years that in theory could be called into question by this executive order, but no one has tested it yet. So it's kind of a brave new world when it comes to federal-state federalism in terms of energy policy. So keep an eye on that. So recapping for now, the electric power has been decarbonizing for the last 2+ decades. We had flat demand growth during that period of time. And so a lot of the incentive was focused on not necessarily how much more power that we needed, but what kind of power did we want? And that's where decarbonization came in, driven by policy incentives, but also by market behavior, because what has happened is whereas wind and solar used to be a lot more expensive than other power sources out there, now it's as cheap, or in solar's case, even cheaper to produce electricity from solar power than it is from other sources. You still have the intermittency issues, like when it's available. So that's when storage is needed, and storage adds to the cost, but it can still be very economic. You're still seeing solar investments, even with the dampening of the tax credits, you're still seeing a lot of solar investment. So it's been decarbonizing for the last couple of decades. And then at the same time, we're now seeing this demand surge growth, and that's really changing the landscape as well as we look forward. But so do the policy shifts. So the previous administration, they were hyper-focused on accelerating decarbonization. The current administration wants to decelerate that or even reverse it. So this has been a rather sudden change in policy perspectives. So the path ahead is really going to be charted by, in many ways, whether the big tech and hyperscalers, how do they respond to this increase in AI demand? How are they going to meet it in terms of how they supply it and how they demand the power that they're going to get and need it to supply the AI algorithms that the market is calling for. How will Congress resolve the big, beautiful bill in the Senate, back in the House, and on the president's desk? Will these clean energy credits be restored, or will they remain out? There's this big tension back and forth. I mean, you know, two of the House members who did not vote for the big, beautiful bill in the House, one of whom was from Ohio, they weren't voting to restore the energy tax credits. They were thinking it didn't go far enough to stem the deficit. I know many of you have probably seen the estimates by the Congressional Budget Office and others saying this would add $2 to $5 trillion to the federal deficit in the next decade or so. A lot of fiscal conservatives certainly are concerned about that and didn't vote for it. So that's a lot of what's being hammered out in the Senate right now. Of course, I didn't really talk about it much, but the tariffs have a big impact, especially in the renewable space, where a lot of the parts are sourced overseas. If we see tariffs put, and a lot of those sources are from China. So looking at the tariff situation overseas, particularly China, really are affecting the cost economics associated with a lot of new capacity generation. And ultimately, it's going to depend on where the investors put their money. I referred to earlier the leveraging of public capital for private capital. You know, ultimately, this gets built not by public fisc, but by private capital. And that's going to be driven by profitability and incentives. And where the incentives drive the profitability is where the money is going to be put down. So with that, I'm wrapped up, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. I also, you know, put my email address and my LinkedIn profile if you want to reach out that way. So Brent, back to you. Looks like we have, you know, about 8 minutes left, and I'm happy to handle any questions that might come forward.
Yeah, Brian, that was fantastic. Wow, packed with information and super interesting look at the energy sector. Some of the big challenges we face today. Really appreciate that. There were a couple questions in the chat. I wanted to start with one of them, and it relates to the question about whether or not production of electricity is done by some of these AI facilities on site, or whether it's mostly done through PPAs. What's your thought on that?
It's mostly done by PPAs now, but the trend is definitely going to on-site. So for instance, because if you can build on-site, and that could be like any kind of generation on-site, there's been a lot of movement. So, you know, I talked about the solar and storage. A lot of that is actually destined for hyperscaler sites so that they don't have to worry about generation not getting onto the grid, because it's, you know, it's basically behind their meter. And so that, you know, I mentioned the interconnection queue 7 to 10 years. Well, if you can build it on site, you don't have to worry about interconnection. So there is definitely movement in that regard. There's also been talk, so I don't want to, I should also mention, you know, some of the things that have been mentioned by this administration, understanding and a desire to dominate in AI, that they see federal facilities like DOE labs as being ideal sites for building infrastructure there. And you can move data centers there. Obviously, the federal government can build without as many restrictions on their land. They're not devoid of restrictions, but they can build faster on DOE facilities. And so early on in the administration, Secretary of Energy and the Secretary of the Interior, who's the head of the National Energy Council, were traveling around the DOE sites, including the National Renewable Energy Lab in Colorado, saying this would be ideal. A lot of people will point out that idea was also launched by the previous administration about a year or two before. But so that can happen. I mean, and that is what's happening. And when I talk about curtailment, that's also a way to deal with curtailment. So like if you have on-site generation, and on-site, and maybe it's from storage or it may be from another type of generator, then you can curtail by not drawing off the grid, by supplying your own, because you don't necessarily want to shut down your data center in order to, because you're curtailing electricity, you still want that to run. And so that's one way to do it.
Yeah, no, that's actually really interesting. So related to that though is, I mean, I heard someone make the argument here in Ohio, you know, so we have a lot of trouble getting new solar and new wind now in place in Ohio because there's a lot of local resistance to it. And there's also some state level resistance to it. So it seems to be slowing down. But the solution I've heard several people suggest is that we just need new transmission. That really what we want to do is put the solar energy production somewhere else and then just transmit that electricity to places like Ohio. So and you were kind of talking about this a second ago, is where we're headed. I mean, you pointed out the transmission stuff to build because there's regulatory constraints and other problems, right? But are we headed to a situation where, data centers are going to go where the electricity is, or are data centers going to go where the people are and the electricity is going to get transmitted to them? Kind of where we
Yes,
headed?
yes, and yes. So so let me go with the second one because I don't want to forget it, but remind me to come back to transmission general. So, we had an event at our Duke and DC office last week where we had all the hyperscalers there. And, so one of them was saying, yeah, we were building a massive data center, a 1.5 gigawatt data center. So 1 gigawatt is the equivalent to about a nuclear power plant. So it's huge, huge load. They're building a data center in Texas where, interestingly, Texas is the leading state in terms of total renewable capacity because they have a lot of wind capacity down there. There are periods of time when there are negative electricity prices in Texas because of sort of local congestion means they're producing more power on the grid. So they're moving the load to where there's an abundance of power. So there's that data center is going to go in near Abilene, Texas, which is right near where the wind belt is in Texas, and they're building a lot of solar down there. So that's one way to do that. One area that is really open for bipartisan support, and there's been a lot of effort under the previous administration and this administration with Congress, is in permitting reform. And if any of you all have read the book Abundance by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, it's a bestseller right now. It really kind of talks about this and kind of lays it out in, it's not super partisan lines, but basically just observes that, the political left has sort of been in favor of a lot of things, but typically building has not been one of them. And now a lot of the things that the political left are in favor of, which is decarbonization of the grid, requires building. And so you've got to have to figure out a way to come up to practical terms. And, and then if you could say the political right is always been in favor of building. I mean, I'm oversimplifying here. This is certainly an area where bipartisan compromise can be had. And I think we're seeing it there. So that's big. But yeah, transmission is hard to build. I've got a colleague at UCLA Law, he used to be a colleague here at Duke Law, who wrote an article called When the Green New Deal Meets the Old Green Laws. And so these well-intentioned laws that have been, protected a lot of natural areas over time from development are also essentially being utilized to keep new infrastructure from being built. So that's also the impetus behind increasing the capacity of our grid as well, so that you don't have to lay new lines. But it's hard for me to imagine a future in which we don't need more transmission infrastructure than we have now. Because we're talking about data centers. If we really were to electrify transportation, I know this administration isn't as in favor of this last administration, but a lot of people who drive electric vehicles, they like them and they want to be, I don't think they're going to go in the negative territory. It's just not going to grow as fast as once anticipated.
Well, I mean, that's super interesting. We probably have to leave it there. It's 1 o'clock. Do want to apologize to Brian Filiatrott, who had a question in the chat. That's kind of a specific question about Ohio. So I also didn't want to put Brian, you on the spot related to a specific bill in Ohio. But we really appreciate you taking the time to enlighten us today with this information about the energy sector and growth in the energy sector. It's pretty astounding to imagine that we're likely heading back into an era of growth in electricity, given where we've been in the last 15 years. It's pretty amazing. And it's exciting to think about, right? A lot of challenges there, but a lot of excitement. And,
yep.
So thanks a lot, Brian, for doing that. Everybody here, the slides and this video will be available and you'll get an email from Diane when that's available online. So you'll be able to go back and have a look at it and feel free to share it with your friends. So thanks again, Brian. Have a great rest of your week, and everybody else have a great week as well.
Thanks, Brent, and all you Buckeyes who listened in. Appreciate it.